Fantastic Four is a better Incredibles movie than Incredibles 2. There, I said it. Come at me. Come at me. Hello everyone, Riley here, and today starts off one of my two new series on this channel, The Cinematic Contrarian. And in this series, I'm going to be taking controversial viewpoints on movies or the film industry and defending them. So this is why Pixar does not understand The Incredibles. To start off, The Incredibles is one of my favorite films of all time. It is what I believe to be my second memory ever is watching The Incredibles in the theaters, and I absolutely adore this film. And Brad Bird has directed my three favorite animated films of all time, so you can imagine that I was pretty excited about Incredibles 2. Then the first trailer dropped, and it was horrible. Just terrible. That first trailer's awful. And that kind of kicked into my head, you better lower your expectations real quick, because if this movie is anything like this trailer, it's gonna suck. So my expectations going into this movie, I made sure they were as low as I could possibly make them, even though it's an Incredibles movie, so they are still pretty high. So when I ended up seeing this movie, I liked it. It was good enough. It had some pretty good characters, decent set pieces. It was pretty fun. It was generally just entertaining from start to finish. And it worked as a superhero movie, but it completely failed as an Incredibles movie. Now, this has to do a lot with the fact that the movie just comes across as generic. The main storyline is just, they need to stop this villain who you don't really know, and it's just any other cookie cutter, we need to stop this villain movie with a more interesting side plot. Overall, it just, the general plot and then the ending in particular is so beaten to death that it didn't feel fresh. While the original, while it did do some of the same tropes that a lot of other action movies or superhero movies had done, it was tongue-in-cheek about them, and it subverted them just slightly enough that you still weren't entirely sure where they were going. This movie was entirely wildly predictable, and I could predict almost the entire movie from the first 15 minutes of it. And a lot of my issues with the plot are with the end. And it just generally felt like there weren't any real stakes, because you could generally see where everything was going, and the voice acting just didn't convey it like the first one. In the first one, you had some fantastic voice acting performances, especially from Holly Hunter, who straight up nailed Elastigirl in the first one. And in the first movie, you felt the sense of stakes, and you felt the impending doom that a lot of these characters were feeling. For example, in the very final scene, even after the main villain had been destroyed, when you see Syndrome take Jack Jack up into the air, when Elastigirl's freaking out, saying, you gotta do something, Bob, you gotta throw something, and then Bob's like, but I might hit Jack Jack, and then Helen just goes, well, then throw me! Throw me, Bob! That had a lot of impact, because the way that the voice actors conveyed it, and the way that it was edited together, you could feel the intensity, and you could feel that the characters were legitimately freaking out. While as in this movie, they just kind of seemed apathetic a little, and it kind of felt like a lot of them were phoning it in, which was disappointing, because the first one, the voice acting was a standout in the first Incredibles movie, and I don't need the voice acting to be a standout in all of the animated movies, but if it wasn't the first one, I was kind of at least expecting that from the second one, because even if the story was weak, I was expecting the voice acting to carry some of it, which it just didn't. That brings me to a lot of the characters. Now, the characters in the first Incredibles movie were the biggest draw of it, and the biggest positive about that movie as a whole. And in this movie, it feels like they just didn't even pay attention to the first one. For example, take Dash. In the first one, he learns how to kind of understand where rules are coming from, and he learns how to be his own individual within society, versus at the beginning of it, he was trying to just go against everything at any given moment. So you would expect that since this takes place about 2 months after the main story of the first one, and immediately after the end tag at the end of the first one, you would expect that character to be the same character that Dash starts out at the beginning of Incredibles 2. Slightly more mature, not very much, but you would expect that. However, in Incredibles 2, Dash is the exact same character that he was at the very beginning of The Incredibles, and he just was more annoying because the voice actor wasn't as good. So it's just like they didn't even bother having any internal consistency with the characters. Look at Violet too. From the first Incredibles movie, her awkwardness and her interactions came a lot to do with the fact that she had so much anxiety built up and so much social anxiety that she didn't really know what to do when she was in these situations, and a lot of it had to come with her gaining confidence throughout the movie. Whereas at the start of Incredibles 2, she's just a whiny teenager who complains about everything and doesn't actually have any of the through line. She's completely anxious about, well, she's stressed out about so many things, yet she takes it out in a completely different way than the anxiety had in the first one. And it just does not feel consistent at all. And even though they did a pretty good job of tying the plot lines together from the first one to the second one, the characters were completely different. Also, Elastigirl. In the first one, Helen is pretty much the only character that really takes charge throughout the entire movie, and she has a definitive voice and says what's on her mind and makes sure that she at least gets her voice out there. They just randomly in this movie give her a whole lot more uncertainty and doubt about her own self that she didn't even have in the first one. So it didn't really feel like a lot of the characters had a lot of consistency. And Jack. While Jack was wildly entertaining throughout this movie, and he had a lot of good humor bits, he became the ultimate MacGuffin, and they just used him to do whatever the plot needed. So now, the fact that he had the powers in the first one, and then the powers in the second one, they're completely different. And it's just lazy. And ultimately, this movie isn't very deep. One of the best things about the first Incredibles movie were the themes. The themes stood out a lot because they were different than you would expect in this type of movie, and they actually said something meaningful. Whereas in this movie, while they keep a lot of the same motifs, such as the legalization of superheroes and the parallels that draws to society, it doesn't really delve with any of the themes that the first one did, or introduce new themes in its own right. The first one had this great commentary on the court system and how people were able to use one bad ruling to implement a lot of negative and harmful legislation, where in this movie they don't even touch on that at all, and that was the main driving point for the entire universe in the first one, and that doesn't even come up in this one. It's just very cookie cutter and very commercial, where that's fine, it was entertaining, it just didn't give anything else. Ultimately, there are two parallels that I can draw to this movie between the first and the second one. First is the animation style. The animation style in the first one, while the animation wasn't nearly as good as the animation of today, it still had depth, and you could see a lot of the movement. Whereas in the second one, it just felt overexposed, shadowed by a white light of the studio, and just overall, it just felt flat. The animation style just felt flat, and it didn't feel as gripping or as real of a universe as the first one did. The title reflects the movie. The first Incredibles movie was called The Incredibles. It's about the Parr family, and that was the main focus of it. Whereas Incredibles 2 drops the, and it's just about supers, and it's just any other superhero movie. So, those were my thoughts on Incredibles 2. I thought it was decent, but not nearly as good as it could have or should have been. And I know a lot of you disagree, and it's breaking box office records every single day. So tell me why you think I'm wrong in the comment section below. And if you like this video, drop a like on this video, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.